The antibody response, otherwise known as the humoral response, occurs after the initial antigen exposure. Without that first antigen exposure, we don't make antibodies to that particular pathogen. This takes time to develop. When we are naive to a particular pathogen, then we lack the ability to respond with our acquired immune system, and instead must rely entirely on our innate immune system until the acquired system has had a chance to go through all of those activation processes, which you're going to remember, I hope you remember, will involve the antigen presentation, activation of those helper T cells, activation of the cytotoxic T cells, activation of the B cells, and from there the development of the B cells into plasma cells. All of this takes time. It's not going to be a fast process. Once the B cells have been activated and differentiated into antibody secreting cells, then we start to see the buildup of antibodies within the blood, or the tears, or the various different body fluids. If we look then at this figure right here, so if we're going to start with the antibody levels in the plasma and look at just the total levels, when we're first exposed, so here's where we'd be exposed to the pathogen. So this would be our viral infection or a bacteria infection. That's when we first get invaded. Between here and here, pretty much entirely the innate immune system is fighting this bacteria, okay? That's pretty much all the innate immune system. And so it's fending it off as best it can. It does a pretty decent job, but for some viruses on their own, it's just not enough, and we really don't rid ourselves of the virus until we start to produce the antibodies. Finally, we're going to start seeing some IgM antibodies being produced, and that's going to happen, so if this is time in weeks, right? This is 1 week. You're going to see about the middle of the week is when we start producing those antibodies. So 2 to 3 days in, maybe 4, depending on how quickly your cells get primed. And we're just going to get some low-level production of this IgM. And a lot of that is going to be done with your effector cells, as we don't quite reach the state of plasma cells yet. And so that's going to matter, at least in terms of how it works, right? So we've got our changing colors here for you, our effector cells, and then we're going to get the plasma cells kick in and really just start to dump these IgM antibodies into our system. Meanwhile, about close to a week, and so right here, so this would be maybe what, day 5-ish, day 6-ish, somewhere along there, we're going to start getting the production of IgG antibodies. And again, once those plasma cells are developed, we're going to start really dumping that into our circulatory system. But you'll notice that we don't hit peak, whoops, that was a bad line. Okay, let's try that again. Peak IgG levels until about 2 weeks in, and we don't hit peak IgM levels until we are at least a week and some change, right? So your typical cold virus, for example, normal for a cold virus to last about 7 to 10 days. And right here you have your answer as to why we really need those antibodies to effectively defeat that virus. And hey, we don't actually start seeing maximum production of these antibodies until, this is probably about day 10. And then here we've got 2 weeks. So some of these diseases last longer. And so it's common to have these illnesses linger until our antibodies are able to build up a response, or B cells are able to build up a response to that. Some of you may have heard of the word titer, okay? If you've been vaccinated against an illness and you lost your vaccination records and you don't really want to get another shot, not that the other shot would hurt you, but you don't want to get another shot, you're going to go into the doctor's office and request a titer. And what they're doing is looking for the levels of antibodies in your blood. Highest during an infection, but look at this. Antibodies levels take a long time to peter out. And the process of these disappearing antibodies, it just takes some time. Let's look at what happens with, and so you can detect those antibodies in the blood at low levels even several weeks later. Let's look at the secondary response. So we've been sick once with this particular antigen or this particular pathogen, and now we're going to get infected a second time by the same pathogen. Now, here's where our memory cells become critical. Look at this. Suddenly, we're flooding the plasma, and let's just quick flick back for comparison. Even at our max level, really scribbly, but max level, that's where we're at, okay? And now let's look back here. Look at our maximum level right here, okay? Huge numbers. And it all starts before, way before it does with the primary infection. And you can see then that these antibodies are ready to go to work. We're reaching maximum level very quickly. So the second exposure generates a much stronger response. And then let's look over here. The levels of antibodies in your plasma stay relatively high. So once you've built up a long-term immunity, that titer that we were talking about earlier, it's easier to detect those antibodies. And so a high titer means you have an immunity to that particular pathogen. So if I were going to go in and to see whether I'm still immune to the measles, so I was vaccinated as a child to measles, mumps, and rubella, and if I wanted to find out, especially with the measles outbreaks we're facing, am I still immune to that? I would go in and I would do a titer, and if I have a high level of antibodies against those measles, the virus that causes measles, then I'm good to go. I should be protected. It's these memory cells that allow the quick response. Rather than having to go through the activation process with the helper T cells, the memory cells just kick it into high gear and start pumping out. They become the plasma cells and start pumping out the antibodies. Here's the cool thing. The memory cells, and this includes memory T cells as well, but they can survive 20 years or more. So measles, mumps, and rubella, my last vaccination was when I was 12 years old. And assuming that I still have a healthy immune system, I should still have a fairly high level of antibodies in my system. Now, antibodies by themselves do not kill anything. Their method of eliminating antigens, or pathogens in this case, is going to rely on three processes that involve other cells or other events. Neutralization refers to the process of agglutination. Right, when we had those antibodies collecting and cross-linking those bacteria cells together to cause them to get trapped essentially into one specific area. And as we start to trap these bacteria and so forth into one region, they're no longer able to invade the tissues because they're stuck. They can't get into the interstitial fluid, they can't get into a cell if it's a virus, and so forth. And so it's pretty important for viruses, bacterial toxins, and so forth, because if it's bound to the antibody, it can't bind anything else, it can't interact with anything else. And so that's the neutralization process. Then we've got pathogen adhesion, which is going to be involving specifically these IgA antibodies, preventing them from adhering to these cells to infect. And then the last is the complementation, or on this page anyway, is the activation of the complement system, which we talked about. And you'll remember that terminates in the membrane attack complex, the release of histamines, and of course opsonization. And that's kind of the funny word we use, but where it essentially, if I have a bacteria and it's covered in antibodies, that makes it a whole lot easier for my phagocytes to find that cell. And so the phagocyte will gobble that cell up. Of course, it takes the antibodies in with it, and the antibodies are destroyed. But since our B cells are pumping out 1 million antibodies per hour, we can sacrifice a few of them. And so the pathogen, the phagocyte, will come in here and go, oh, yum, and we'll eat that cell. And then we've got antigen presentation and destruction of the pathogen and so forth. Stimulation of inflammation, I actually mentioned this by mentioning the histamine release, by stimulating those mast cells and the B cells. And I got ahead of myself a little bit, the opsonization, coating it so the pathogen or the phagocytes can find them. And then last, the presence of antibodies act to attract cells. So they're not really a cytokine, but they work like cytokines in that manner. And then this is the agglutination process. It kind of goes hand in hand. It's a little bit difficult to separate out this naturalization process from the actual agglutination process. But this is where we're going to get those complexes that are formed. Here we can actually see this visual picture of this process where you can see precipitation and agglutination. You can see how these pathogens here are being cross-linked together into a big old complex. We've got the stimulation of the inflammation, attraction of the phagocytes, opsonization, activation of the complement system, and so forth. These are the processes of the antibodies.